Mika?
A Russian diplomat to the United Nations has resigned over the war in Ukraine, saying he has never been so ashamed of his country. Boris Bondarev, the first Russian diplomat to step down over the war. In a scathing letter, he says he was left with no other choice. It reads in part this: never have I been so ashamed of my country as on February 24th of this year. The aggressive war unleashed by Putin against Ukraine and, in fact, against the entire Western world is not only a crime against the Ukrainian people, but also perhaps the most serious crime against the people of Russia, with a bold letter Z crossing out all hopes and prospects for a prosperous, free society in our country. Those who conceived this war want only one thing: to remain in power forever, live in pompous, tasteless palaces, sail on yachts comparable in tonnage and cost to the entire Russian Navy, enjoying unlimited power and complete impunity. Today, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is not about diplomacy. It is all about warmongering, lies, and hatred. The ministry has become my home and my family, but I simply cannot any longer share in this bloody, witless, and absolutely needless ignominy. Joe, not mincing words, that's, I think, a huge blow to Vladimir Putin.
Well, it certainly is an embarrassment. We've seen in the past how Vladimir Putin treats people who cross him and embarrass him like this. So it wasn't a statement. It wasn't a move made without risk to himself and to his family members. He had to know that before he made it. But it shows, just like the retired military man that went on Russian television a few weeks ago and just completely eviscerated the army, talked about how Putin's decision to threaten Finland was laughable. He mocked it. And he talked about how Russians were isolated in the world. Let's bring in right now columnist at the Washington Post, Max Boot. He's also, of course, a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and U.S. special correspondent for BBC News, Caddy Kay. And Caddy, it's almost like we're looking again up at a May Day parade during the Cold War and trying to figure out exactly what's going on with the Politburo, who's shifting where. I mean, the criminologists certainly have to be looking at this statement, have to be looking at what happened on Russian state television and asking what's going on, because we know that Vladimir Putin doesn't allow any criticism.
Yeah, that was my exact first reaction, that this reminded me of those defections during the Cold War where somebody would manage to get out of the grip of the Kremlin, escape across the borders, and suddenly do a kind of tell-all on what it was really like behind the Iron Curtain. And to hear this diplomat, who must be incredibly brave to speak out like this, knowing how Vladimir Putin can retaliate against people who have crossed him, even when they're on foreign soil. I mean, literally, this man's life is now potentially in danger. We've seen him take action against former spies on British soil. There's no reason to think that he wouldn't do the same to this diplomat who was in Geneva. There was something that he said, I think, in that statement, the thing about the Russian leader wanting just to remain in power forever, that I thought was particularly chilling. There's no succession plan for Vladimir Putin. He hasn't thought what happens beyond him. And if now his own aim is just to stay in power forever, potentially, when he talks about using nuclear weapons if there is an existential threat to the country, what he really means is an existential threat to his regime and therefore to himself. And if he starts to see his options narrowing and sees no way out, and that he is going to lose that regime, then I think that's when Vladimir Putin gets really dangerous. And it takes this Russian diplomat bravely to point that out to everybody. But those were the words that I found particularly chilling, because the implications of them in terms of how Russia might expand eventually this war, were it to do so, I think is really about Putin identifying himself with the regime. The country is Putin. The regime is Putin. It's all about Putin being there forever.
You know, Max, your feelings about Russia the former Soviet Union, obviously personal, as were Mika's father, Dr. Brzezinski. And you certainly have some insights on Russia that others don't. I'm curious, what are we to make of these signs of dissent, whether it's coming in Geneva, where he's beyond the reach of Vladimir Putin, or whether it's a highly respected military man going on television and completely mocking and eviscerating Vladimir Putin's strategic moves? What do we make of that?
Well, clearly, Joe, there is dissent in upper-level Russian circles. People do have access to information, even though Putin has tried to crack down on that. They can get it through Telegram and other sources. And clearly, I think most of the Russian elites were shocked and surprised by Putin's invasion of Ukraine. He did not mobilize public support for this war of aggression, and I'm sure that most of the elites are horrified by what Putin is doing, but they also are fear for their lives. If they stand up to Putin, he has complete control of the state, so they don't really have any way of changing his policy, and that's kind of the tragedy of Russia right now, Joe, is that everybody, I think most of the elites in Russia can see the terrible course that they are on under Putin, the tragedy for both, not just for Ukraine, but for Russia, but they really can't do anything about it because it's a one-man state, even more so than it was in the days of the Communist Party, when at least you had a Politburo and there was some collective check and balance on the supreme leader. Right now, it's just Putin, and it's not clear who he listens to, how he makes decisions, or whether he cares whether the elites are behind him or not, because his message is, you know, get behind me or suffer the consequences.
So your piece in the Washington Post, it's entitled "Don't Worry About Putin's Feelings." I think I have at least one brother and a husband who agrees with this. The Russian offensive appears to be petering out, and a major Ukrainian counteroffensive is still to come. But instead of celebrating the Ukrainians' progress, many in the West are reacting with trepidation. French President Emmanuel Macron is warning that Russia must not be humiliated. Italy is circulating its own 4-point peace plan. Given that the world widely expected Kyiv to fall within 3 days of a Russian invasion, it is the height of hubris to say what Ukraine can or cannot achieve on the battlefield. Given the horrors that Russia has inflicted on the areas it has conquered, which include rape, murder, and deportation, it is the height of inhumanity to insist that Ukraine turn over any of its people to indefinite Russian occupation. More likely, Putin would view any preemptive concessions as a sign of faltering resolve and simply redouble his determination to outlast his enemies. It's time to stop worrying about sparing Putin's feelings. Russia must suffer such a devastating defeat that it will be many decades before another Russian leader thinks of attacking a peaceful neighbor. I agree. It makes sense, especially when you think about the atrocities. I can't believe anybody would want to put Ukraine in the position of having to cede any territory, anybody, to Russia. But they have nukes. So what do you say to those who say, well, we're trying to avoid a World War III here?
Well, I agree we should try to avoid a World War III, and that's why I've been opposed to getting U.S. forces directly involved in the war. I've been opposed to a no-fly zone because I think that's too dangerous. But this is a different category, Mika. This is not about the United States going to war with Russia. This is about Ukrainians fighting back against the invasion that Russia has mounted against their own country. And the risk of nuclear escalation is one that the Ukrainians are willing to bear. I mean, let's be clear here. The odds of Putin using a nuclear weapon, I think, are quite low. But if he were to use one, it would be most likely in Ukraine. It's not going to be against NATO because he's not going to start World War III. The Ukrainians are aware of that, but they are fighting on anyway. They are not being deterred. And so my view is we're sitting here on the sidelines. We're supporting them from afar. They are fighting our battles for us, Mika. They're not just defending themselves. They're defending us. They're defending Europe. They're defending the entire civilized world. And they're willing to bear the risk. They're fighting. They're dying. They're suffering the horrific consequences of Russian barbarism and brutality. And so who are we to say, oh, we're too worried about Russia, don't go too far? No, I mean, obviously, there are lines they should not cross. I don't think they should invade Russia itself. They shouldn't bomb Moscow. There are things that are over the top. Right. But in terms of fighting for their own territory, which Russia has stolen from them, they have every right to do that. They are doing that right now, and we need to support them instead of second-guessing what they're doing.
Columnist at the Washington Post, Max Boot, well said. And